All right, Larry, we're back, and this
We
is the
are
second video in a series about Candida auris and
a deadly fungus.
potentially linking this fungus to an infection related to a gastroscope. But
Yes,
on the last video, we told everybody that we were going to describe and give some background on Candida auris in
right.
case they're not already familiar. And then we're also going to be talking about some potential risk factors that may have played a part in this particular case. So, starting at the top,
And modes of transmission.
as you mentioned, it was an emerging fungus, right? Rapidly spreading. But can you tell us about kind of the etiology of Candida auris and why it's such a concerning pathogen?
So about in 2009, if I have my year correct, this particular organism started to emerge in the United States. It's problematic for a number of reasons. It's spreading rapidly worldwide, but there were very few cases in the United States going back about 15 years, and now it's becoming more and more prevalent. And you can look at these maps that the CDC provides and see was very similar to when COVID started migrating from the West Coast to the East Coast. You could actually start looking at a map of the states and see where COVID had been identified and where it had not been. And this is very similar with this emerging fungus called, as we said, Candida auris. Cousins of the Candida family that some may be familiar is Candida aspergillus, for example, that has been identified and growing in the moist internal channels of endoscopes that are improperly stored. But in this case, I found this medical device report that we discussed in a previous video that linked in a patient testing positive for this Candida organism and patient exposure to a gastroscope. And this opens a whole can of worms because we have not before, I'm not aware of any report ever linking patient exposure to a flexible endoscope, in this case a gastroscope, to a patient either being colonized or infected with this specific fungus. So this is big news. This is something we want to talk about and walk through for our audience. The reason why it's specifically concerning, Justin, is for three reasons in particular. One is patients that get infected with it have about a 1 in 2 chance of survival. It has a very
Wow.
high mortality rate. It is typically or very often multi-drug resistant to fungal medications, and in some cases it is pan-resistant. There's no medications that can treat it, and that's similar to some of the other organisms we've talked about through the years. CRE, for example, becoming resistant to carbapenem antibiotics, requiring last resort antibiotics to save these patients' lives to treat these infections. One thing about Candida auris also that's very, very important is its epidemiology that our listeners want to be aware of. How is it transmitted? Can it really be transmitted by an endoscope? What is it just transmitted by contaminated hands due to poor hand hygiene? What exactly is going on here? So in particular, we know, again, for COVID, that, for example, is transmitted primarily by the airborne route. The flu is transmitted primarily by the droplet route, and here we have Candida auris, that's transmitted by the indirect or direct physical contact route. So that's very important.
This is kind of scary, Larry. I just want to chime in on that. So you're saying that, like, typically some of the things that we've talked about in the past is sort of a process issue in terms of how we clean a scope, right? Or how effectively we clean it. But I'm kind of understanding that the implications here could be that it could be completely unrelated to the actual device and a lot more about the healthcare workers that are handling the device. Is that where this is kind of going in terms of mode of transmission?
It is, as well as other procedures being performed at the time that the patient was exposed to the gastroscope that might cause the gastroscope to almost be like a red herring, where it wasn't the gastroscope, it was another simultaneous procedure performed that we can talk about. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video. But specifically to the mode of transmission for example, a CRE, or in this case, Candida, the modes of transmission generally, we talked about the three modes: airborne, droplet, and direct contact. Candida auris is the third mode, direct or indirect contact. And what this means is that in theory, a reusable medical device could be one of the modes that could transmit this. An index patient sitting in the next room, if you're in direct contact with them and their colonizer infected with the Candida auris, you could become infected. A healthcare worker's hands that are colonized or weren't thoroughly cleaned could expose you and infect you with Candida. Again, we talked about this being the direct or indirect route. Environmental surfaces, so a handrail or a doorknob. This is a surface that, if contaminated and colonized, and you touch it when you're in the healthcare setting, you could then be exposed and infected with Candida. Candida auris is generally, particularly patients that are particularly susceptible to this are at-risk patients that we can talk a little bit about also in the next video. But I will point out that I did do a research and found that there was a reusable shared medical device that has been directly linked to Candida auris, reusable axillary temperature probes, and that's why the possibility that gastroscopes could be transmitting this Candida auris is definitely on our radar and something for us to be concerned about. So we want to be very vigilant that indeed this organism could be transmitted by endoscopes.
All right, last part before we wrap this video up. As the risk factors may be related to the gastroscope that was in the report that you were looking into, how does this come in? What are some of the risk factors that people want to keep in mind before we come back on the next video and give them some guidance and conclusions on this?
Right, and I think maybe we'll talk a little bit more in detail about those risk factors, but I'll say briefly now that there are a number of risk factors. For example, a patient who is elderly, immunosuppressed. Risk factors are patients who are exposed, as we talked about, to an instrument that's contaminated, a physician or surgeon's hands that are contaminated, environmental surface that's contaminated. But in this specific MAUD report, medical device report, when the patient was exposed to the gastroscope, they were also undergoing a procedure called PEG tube placement. And what exactly is that? That's a percutaneous endoscopic gastroscopy. That's a lot to say. So when a patient is a risk factor for exposure and infection from Candida auris, when they're also undergoing the placement of this PEG tube, typically for nutritional purposes. So we'll talk a little bit about that more, but these risk factors are very important to try to identify the root cause of infection, and we'll talk about that in the next video.
All right. Well, one more video coming. We're going to be talking about guidance, drawing some conclusions as well. But don't forget to find these and all of our videos on our YouTube channel that recently launched for Transmission Control. Thanks so much for tuning in.